Karen's voice trembled with urgency as she gripped her phone, eyes locked onto the black man sitting calmly in his car. She didn't know who he was, but to her, he didn't belong. "There's a suspicious man outside my house," she whispered, voice laced with forced fear. Inside the car, Marcus sighed, already sensing where this was going. He had seen that look before, the kind that turned ordinary moments into police encounters. As sirens echoed in the distance, Karen smirked, convinced she had won. But she had no idea that Marcus was about to uncover something that would change everything. The peaceful morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood was shattered by the shrill voice of Karen, a middle-aged woman with a sharp bob and an ever-present scowl. She clutched her phone with tense fingers, pacing back and forth on her pristine lawn, her gaze locked onto the black man sitting in his car at the edge of her driveway. Her voice was thick with exaggerated urgency as she barked into the phone. "Yes, there's a suspicious man outside my house. He's just sitting there and I don't feel safe," she said, stealing glances at the vehicle parked just a few feet away. "I don't know what he's doing, but he looks threatening. Can you send someone quickly?" Inside the car, Marcus exhaled deeply, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. He had seen this play out before, too many times in too many places. He had only parked here for a moment, checking some details on his phone before heading to a meeting. But that didn't matter to people like her. To Karen, his very presence was an offense. He resisted the urge to engage. Years of experience had taught him that any response, polite, firm, or indifferent, would only feed into whatever story she was spinning. So he stayed where he was, calm and unmoving, watching as she paced with theatrical distress, glancing between her phone and his car like he was an armed robber preparing to strike. "He's still here." She nearly screeched into the phone. "I don't know what he's waiting for. He's in a black sedan, tinted windows. It looks shady." Marcus shook his head slightly, bemused. His windows weren't even tinted. The car was a rental, clean and basic. But Karen, in her desperation to be the heroine of some imagined crime drama, was seeing what she wanted to see. A neighbor across the street peered through his blinds, drawn by Karen's frantic energy. Another woman walking her dog paused briefly before shaking her head and moving on, unwilling to get involved. This wasn't new to them. Karen had always been the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, calling the police for everything from teenagers playing music to delivery drivers taking too long. Marcus glanced at his watch. He had things to do, but now he was stuck in a situation that could escalate quickly. Should he drive away? No. That would look like fleeing, and he had nothing to run from. Confront her? Absolutely not. He knew better than to give her the satisfaction of twisting his words into a threat. So, he sat. He waited. He let Karen's paranoia run its course. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens reached his ears, and he sighed. "Here we go." As the police car rolled onto the street, Karen waved dramatically, pointing at Marcus as if she had just uncovered a dangerous criminal. The officer, stepping out, already looked exasperated. Marcus leaned back in his seat, bracing himself. He had no idea that what was about to unfold would turn the tables entirely. Marcus kept his hands resting on the steering wheel as he watched the woman pace a few steps away, still on the phone with 911. Her voice had risen in pitch, her words growing more dramatic with every sentence. She kept glancing back at him, eyes wide, as if trying to convince herself of the danger she was fabricating. "He's just sitting there, staring at me," she was saying. "I don't know what he's planning, but I'm scared. He won't tell me why he's here." Marcus exhaled slowly. He had encountered people like her before, people who believed their discomfort was more important than reality. He had seen enough news stories to know how easily situations like this could escalate. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He knew exactly why he was here, and he wasn't about to be intimidated into leaving. He glanced at the folder beside him, filled with property records, tax documents, and legal filings. He had been looking into this neighborhood for months, researching foreclosure properties, checking deeds, and identifying investment opportunities. His job required him to be thorough, to understand every detail before making a move. That was why he had parked there, to review the paperwork before heading to a meeting. He looked back at the woman, who had now stepped farther up her driveway, still watching him like he was some kind of intruder. Ironically, he knew more about this neighborhood than she did. He knew which houses were in financial trouble, which ones had liens against them, and which ones would soon be hitting the market. He had spent weeks analyzing trends, looking at ownership histories, and uncovering hidden details that most people never bothered to check. And that was when it hit him. Her house. He had seen that address before. Marcus reached for his folder and flipped through the pages, his fingers moving quickly over the documents. He scanned down the lists, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the familiar numbers. There it was. Her house was in trouble. Property tax delinquency, overdue payments, the beginnings of foreclosure proceedings. His lips pressed into a thin line. This woman, so eager to call the police on a black man simply sitting in his car, had no idea that her own home was in jeopardy. She was standing there, calling him a threat, that while she had far bigger problems heading her way. He almost laughed at the irony. The sound of sirens broke through the quiet street, and he closed the folder, setting it back on the seat beside him. He had nothing to hide. Let the police come. He would answer their questions, stay calm, and do what he always did, handle the situation with logic and patience. What he wouldn't do, however, was leave. Not yet. Because now he had a reason to stay. The police car rolled up slowly, its flashing lights casting red and blue streaks across the pavement. Marcus sat still, his hands visible on the steering wheel, already anticipating what was coming next. He had been through this before. Too many times, in fact. The routine was always the same. The officer would approach with caution, hand near their holster, assessing him as if he were a threat rather than a man simply minding his own business. The woman, still clutching her phone, rushed toward the officers as soon as they stepped out. Her face was a mask of fear, her gestures exaggerated as she pointed toward Marcus's car. "There he is," she exclaimed, her voice laced with urgency. "He's been sitting here, refusing to leave, and he got aggressive when I asked him to move. I feel completely unsafe in my own home." Marcus took a deep breath, suppressing the frustration bubbling inside him. He had said nothing aggressive. He had barely spoken to her at all. But people like her knew how to play the victim when it suited them. One of the officers, a tall man with a buzz cut, turned to Marcus and approached the car window. "Sir, can you roll down your window and show me some identification?" Marcus complied, moving slowly, knowing any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. He handed over his license, and then calmly said, "I'm just parked here reviewing some work documents, and I'm not blocking her driveway and I haven't done anything wrong." The officer glanced back at the woman, who had folded her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. "Ma'am, is he actually blocking your driveway?" "Yes, well, kind of," she stammered. "He's right there, making me uncomfortable." Marcus held back a sigh. Uncomfortable. That was always the word. It didn't mean danger. It didn't mean crime. It just meant that his presence was something she didn't like. The officer nodded slightly and turned back to Marcus. "What kind of work are you doing here, sir?" Now was the moment. Marcus reached over, picked up the folder, and flipped it open. He pulled out a page and handed it to the officer. "I'm a real estate investor. I'm researching properties in this neighborhood, including this one." The officer glanced at the document, his brows furrowing. The woman, suddenly curious, leaned in slightly. "This address," Marcus continued, looking straight at her now, "is listed in public records as having outstanding property taxes. It's currently in pre-foreclosure, which means," he said, his voice steady, "that very soon it may not be your house anymore." The woman's face drained of color. The officer, now genuinely interested, flipped through the paperwork. "Ma'am, is this correct?" he asked. What?" she stuttered. "No, that can't be right." But Marcus knew it was, and now, so did she. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The woman's mouth opened and closed as if searching for words, but nothing came out. She glanced at the officer, then back at Marcus, then at the papers in his hands, as though willing them to be some kind of mistake. "This is ridiculous," she finally blurted out, her voice higher now, tinged with panic. "I own this house. I've lived here for years." Marcus remained calm. "I'm sure you have," he said evenly, "but that doesn't change the fact that your property has unpaid taxes and is in pre-foreclosure." He tapped the paper with his index finger. "It's all public record." The officer skimmed the document, his expression shifting from neutral to something more serious. He turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, do you have any outstanding debts on your property? Have you received any notices from the county?" She took a step back, shaking her head wildly. "No." "Well, maybe there were some letters, but there's nothing to do with him." She pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "He has no right to be here, snooping into my business." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle. "You called the police on me," he reminded her. "I was sitting in my car, doing my work, and you made it my business." The second officer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Ma'am, if what he's saying is true, then this is a legal issue, not a police matter." He looked at Marcus. "And you're saying this house is part of your research?" "That's correct," Marcus replied. "I look into properties that may be heading toward foreclosure. Some are good investment opportunities." He turned back to the woman. "And yours?" "Well, it's got a hefty tax lien on it. If you don't handle it soon, it'll be auctioned off." The woman looked like she had been slapped. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her entire demeanor shifting from smug authority to defensive desperation. "This is my home," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. This isn't right." Marcus simply shrugged. "Maybe you should have checked your own paperwork before checking mine." The first officer sighed and handed Marcus back his ID. "Sir, you're free to go. Sorry for the inconvenience." Marcus took his license and slid it back into his wallet. "No problem, officer." But as he started his car, he glanced at the woman one last time. Her confidence was gone. The power she thought she held over him had crumbled the moment she realized she had bigger problems than a man parked on the street. She had called the police thinking she could intimidate him, thinking her words alone would be enough to remove him. Instead, she was the one left standing in the driveway, reeling from a reality she hadn't been prepared to face. And Marcus, he simply drove away, knowing full well that she would remember this moment for a long time. As Marcus drove away, he couldn't help but shake his head at the irony of it all. The woman, so quick to call the police on him for simply existing, had been forced to face a truth far bigger than whatever imaginary threat she thought he posed. He had seen it in her eyes, that sudden shift from righteous indignation to raw panic. She had been so sure she held the power in the situation, but the reality was that she was losing something far more important than an argument with a stranger in her driveway. The sound of sirens faded into the distance as he pulled onto the main road. He glanced at the folder in the passenger seat, flipping it open at a red light. Her property was just one of many he had been researching, but now it stood out in a way the others didn't. He wondered how long she had been ignoring the notices piling up in her mailbox, pretending that if she didn't acknowledge them, they wouldn't be real. That was the thing about entitlement. It gave people the illusion that rules didn't apply to them. By the time Marcus got home, he had almost put the whole incident out of his mind. Almost. But something about it still lingered with him. The way she had looked at him, the way she had clutched her phone like a weapon, convinced that her words alone could erase his presence. He had seen that look before. He had felt that shift before. A few weeks passed and Marcus had nearly forgotten about the woman. He had other properties to look at, other investments to focus on, but one afternoon while scrolling through foreclosure notices, something caught his eye. Her address. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he clicked on the listing. It was official. The house was scheduled for auction in just a few weeks. He tapped his fingers against the desk, considering the situation. He could easily make a bid. It was a good property, after all. Prime location, solid structure. The financial situation wasn't terrible. She had just let things slip too far. And now she was paying the price. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Part of him wondered if she had even seen this coming, or if she was still living in denial, thinking she could find a way out at the last minute. But that wasn't his problem. Business was business. On the day of the auction, Marcus stood in the back of the room, watching as bids were placed. The numbers climbed, but not high enough to push him out. When his turn came, he raised his hand. The auctioneer called out the final offer. No one outbid him. Within minutes, it was done. The house belonged to him now. And as Marcus signed the paperwork, he couldn't help but wonder what the woman would think when she realized that the man she had called the police on was now the rightful owner of the home she once thought was untouchable.